Okay, this section of the course, or this lesson, I should say, is from the last very small section of chapter 2 of your book. It's evaluating arguments. And they really only give you 2 paragraphs here about it, and I think that actually more should be said. So we're going to say a little bit more about it. You now, from the prior lessons, should have a pretty clear picture about, there we go, evaluating arguments. Have a pretty clear picture of what an argument is. It's, when I say that, what I mean is the essential components of an argument, that it has really 2 components, a conclusion and premise or premises, and that there are 2 different ways that the premises and conclusion can relate, and the 2 different ways that they can relate are indicated by the argument being either deductive or inductive. If the speaker intends, or it is obvious that in the argument the premises are supposed to guarantee the conclusion or to make that conclusion certain, then we have what we refer to as a deductive argument. If, however, the premises are intended to make the conclusion more likely to be true, and though perhaps not guarantee them, then we have an inductive argument. But all arguments fundamentally work the same way, no matter which type. There is something to be accepted as true, that is the conclusion, and it is to be accepted as true for 2 reasons. Because the premises are true, the reasons why I give you to believe it are true, and because those true premises imply that the conclusion is true. So in an argument, there's really 2 things going on. I want to prove to you that the conclusion is true because, 1, the premises are true, and 2, the premises imply the conclusion, either inductively or deductively prove the conclusion or make the conclusion likely. Either way, they establish the conclusion. Given this structure, there are really only 2 things to look for when you're evaluating an argument. Okay? Now, the book describes these 2 things in interesting language. It calls it the logic part and the truth part. Now, I'm not going to call it that. I think it's more intuitive to think of this section in terms of the questions that you would ask yourself when you are evaluating an argument, either your own or someone else's. Okay? What's the first question that you would ask yourself? The first question you would ask yourself, and this is going to be fairly intuitive to most of us, right, is, are the premises true? When I give you an argument, the point of the argument is to establish that the conclusion is true. That it's true, for example, that global warming is the most serious threat facing humanity today. This is what Al Gore would have us believe. Don't hear me saying that rhetorically. I'm not saying he's right or he's wrong. I'm neutral on this, but he does believe this, and this is something that he does attempt to prove to us, okay? Now, when he asserts this and he attempts to prove this, one of the things that we should do, the first thing that we should do, is ask whether the reasons he's giving us for believing that are true. If all of Al Gore's data is fabricated or misunderstood or inaccurate in any other way, that is, if his premises are not true, then we have a very good reason for rejecting his argument. That is, for rejecting that the conclusion will be true on the basis of those things. on the basis of the data he provides. If that data is not true, then it can't ensure the truth of the conclusion. Let me say that again, because this is really, really important. Do the truth of the premise, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Are the premises true? I am to believe that the conclusion is true because the premises are true. If I have false premises, if I give you a false reason to believe something, you know immediately to reject my argument. The second thing to look for, and this is what your book refers to as the logic part, is really whether the inference is good or whether the premises either support, inductive, or guarantee, deductive, the conclusion. Now think about that for a second. What we are asking here is not whether the premises are true or not. We want to know whether, if the premises were true, they would support or guarantee the conclusion. If the evidence that Al Gore gives is true, does it support or guarantee his conclusion? Is it possible that everything he say is true and that his conclusion be false? Or is it possible for his premises to be true, but it be unlikely that his conclusion is true? What we are asking about with this second question is not the status of the premises themselves, whether they are true or false. We're asking about the relationship that they possess to the conclusion. That is, on the assumption that the premises were true, would they support or guarantee the conclusion? Okay. Now, those are the 2 points that we assess when we critically evaluate an argument. We don't go beyond that. That's it. And an important point for you to understand is that when you're evaluating someone's argument, we're not assessing whether or not we think the conclusion is true in and of itself or by itself. I'm fond of telling my students that I don't care if they believe that E.T. lives in their closet and comes out every Tuesday and Thursday to eat Reese's Pieces and phone home. So long as they have a good reason for believing that, they have a good argument. This brings up a really important point. An argument is separate from its conclusion. You assess an argument different or separate from its conclusion. That is, that the conclusion is true or false is supposed to be guaranteed or made likely by the premises, and it's that you're looking at when you're assessing an argument. You're not just looking at the conclusion. You're not just saying, well, they believe this, so no matter what they have to say, they're wrong, or they got this wrong. That's not a fair way to assess an argument. You're assessing the conclusion, but you're not assessing the argument, because the argument is the premises and the inference to the conclusion. Okay? But those are separate issues, and it will be important for you to understand that there are 2 questions that we ask when we assess an argument, but we never ask whether we think the conclusion is true. Now, when I say that, it's not that assessing arguments doesn't lead to truth. That's supposed to be the point. The point is that if the premises are true and they support the conclusion, or they even guarantee the conclusion, then it's rational to believe in the conclusion. But you don't decide whether the conclusion is true or evaluate an argument for a conclusion just by looking at the conclusion itself, deciding you don't agree and so throwing out the argument. There might be very good arguments for conclusions that you don't agree with, and if the arguments are good and you don't agree with the conclusion, then you need to take into account that argument. You can't just bypass it by sort of rejecting the idea out of hand that the conclusion can be true. That is the kind of thinking that is flawed. That is the kind of thinking that doesn't follow logic. It just follows whatever prejudices or biases we bring to the table as thinkers. The point of an argument is to support or prove a conclusion. And that's what we assess, whether or not it does support or prove a conclusion. And we assess that independent of whether we think the conclusion by itself is true or false. So, all right, there's a quick 10-minute lesson on that. I hope that was helpful. If you have questions, let me know.